Okay, it looks like it's top of the hour. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar. Just a couple quick things before we get started. Feel free to submit any of your questions in the chat function throughout the webinar, and we'll try to get to those at the end. And your certificates for the US attendees will be available this Friday by logging into your account and downloading those there. Rebecca, if you'd like to get started, go right ahead.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Make sure I can do my slides. All right. So today I'm going to be talking to you for the next 45 minutes or so about mother's milk biomarkers. So how can we measure, predict, and hopefully modify lactation success? Here's my disclosure slide. So my objectives today are to summarize how early milk volumes predict long-term lactation success. And I'll mainly be focusing on the preterm population. We'll briefly review the physiology of secretory activation and why it's so important for long-term lactation. And then finally explore the use of biomarkers of secretory activation in both the term and the preterm populations, with the overall goal of trying to figure how we can predict lactation problems earlier and potentially modify them. So I certainly don't have to tell anyone listening today that mother's own milk is the best thing for all babies. It's really the gold standard because we know it significantly improves outcomes. In the preterm population, which as a neonatologist is one of my specialty, we know it reduces morbidities during the NICU stay. This includes costly and potentially life-threatening diseases like neck and late onset sepsis. But we know in all babies, whether you're term or preterm, it improves long-term neurodevelopmental outcomes and IQ in a dose-response manner. So the more milk you get, the better. We know it reduces costly and chronic conditions like asthma and obesity in children, and it's good for mom. It reduces her risk of lifetime female cancers as well as type 2 diabetes. And importantly, and we need to really educate our families about this, donor milk is not an equal alternative. We know it doesn't have all the same amazing qualities that mother's milk has, with the exception of reduction in neck. And I'll point out that I'm going to be using the term mother's own milk throughout the talk, just because that's common in the literature. I do recognize that not everyone who lactates identifies as a mother, but I'll be using that term. So despite these benefits of human milk, many babies don't receive prolonged or exclusive mother's milk. So here in Canada, I previously practiced in the States and I've been in Canada for a couple of years now, the vast majority of our moms initiate lactation, so 92%. However, when you look at hospital discharge, which is only typically at 1 to 3 days of life, only 62% of moms are exclusively breastfeeding and often have started small amounts of formula supplementation, whether it's medically indicated or not. When you look at 6 months, only 57% of Canadian women are breastfeeding at all, and that's in a place that does have protected maternity leave. And exclusively, only a third of moms. So clearly, both in Canada as well as in the States and many other parts of the world, we have a really long way to go before we meet those guidelines of either the WHO or of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations for exclusive milk for the first 6 months of life. Now, why is this? Because clearly if 92% of moms are initiating lactation, the vast majority, sorry for these pop-ups here, I thought I turned them all off. The vast majority of moms still want to lactate, but clearly are not able to meet those self-imposed lactation goals. When you do qualitative studies asking moms about this, you get the same answer over and over. The majority who stop lactating earlier than they want state that the baby just didn't seem satisfied with their breast milk alone, or they're concerned that the baby just wasn't getting enough milk, so they felt like they had to supplement with formula. But when we look at these long-term lactation outcomes, the problem typically doesn't start when the baby's a few months old. So to understand why moms have challenges with long-term lactation, we really need to reverse and go back in time to earlier in her lactation story. So here I'm going to focus on the preterm population a bit, and we'll look at NICU discharge and predictors of milk at that point. So a myriad of studies specific to the preterm population have tried to predict long-term lactation. And over, we see that the duration of exclusive mother's own milk feeds in the NICU correlates to lactation later. So this should be pretty obvious. If you have good milk volumes and you're able to exclusively breastfeed your baby throughout the NICU, then you're probably going to be able to continue that past NICU discharge. So that's not that helpful because we actually need to know, well, how do we get our moms to be exclusively breastfeeding at NICU discharge? So again, we have to back up, rewind the lactation story, and look at the first 2 weeks or so of life. And we know the first 2 weeks postpartum are really critical for lactation initiation. So in the first 10 to 14 days postpartum, coming to volume, which is pumping at least 500 mLs a day, appears to be the biggest predictor of mother's own milk feedings at NICU discharge. And this has been reported with my group in Chicago, as well as other groups. And this goes beyond other maternal risk factors. It seems to be very important for these first 2 weeks as far as volumes. And conversely, infants that receive less than 75% of feeds of mother's own milk at day 14 are much more likely to be exclusively formula fed in the first 6 weeks after NICU discharge. So we know to breastfeed in the long term, you need to be breastfeeding at NICU discharge. And we know to be breastfeeding at NICU discharge, you have to have good volumes in the first 2 weeks. So again, how do we get good volumes in the first 2 weeks? So let's keep rewinding and go to those first couple of days, the first days after the baby's born. So Murace and Namsam Rivers, as well as Hill, have both reported that low pumped milk volumes, which they defined as less than 150 mLs a day on day 4 postpartum, is associated with a 7 to 10 times greater risk of formula feeding at the NICU discharge or beyond. And you'll notice that all of these previous studies talk about volume and volume measurements as a predictor. So this is useful because volume or milk volumes have been validated in many populations. However, as one of my colleagues who wrote this nice review article has stated, milk volumes aren't really measuring what you want them to measure. They're not exactly measuring secretory activation because they're measuring both milk production, but also how well the mom is getting the milk out. So you're also measuring the effectiveness and efficiency of milk removal. Volume measurements also require accuracy. So if a mom is breastfeeding exclusively, test weights, or if she's pumping, you need to be recording every single pumping session and either visually assessing volume, which isn't as accurate, or weighing, which then requires a scientific scale. So it's not a perfect predictor or measurement for looking at secretory activation. So clearly there has to be a better way. And you can probably guess since I'm giving this talk, I think the answer is physiologic biomarkers of lactation. So in order to understand how these biomarkers work and how you can interpret them, you need to briefly be able to understand lactation. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Lactation is incredibly complex and we still don't actually understand all of it. But I think it's important to know. And I certainly, for one, as a physician, don't think I actually learned this at all in medical school. Maybe I was gone that day, but I swear this was not covered, which is bizarre considering that the vast majority of the world's population has either been breastfed or will breastfeed in their life. I also didn't learn about it in residency and maybe just a little bit in neonatology fellowship. So I think this is something that is really poorly understood by physicians and healthcare providers, let alone the general public. So prior to pregnancy, but after puberty, the breast is quiescent. And during pregnancy, secretory differentiation occurs. So those cells are differentiating and getting ready to be able to make milk. And they actually start doing so during pregnancy. So colostrum is made in small amounts starting at 16 weeks. But as you know, moms don't make copious milk during pregnancy. And this is because most components of the colostrum are excreted into the urine because paracellular pathways in the breast are leaky or open, as you can see in this little visual in the top right. And I'll discuss that some more in detail in a second. So once the baby's born, the breast moves from secretory differentiation to secretory activation. So in a healthy term delivery, this typically should occur within 72 hours. Now, this definitely is sometimes not true if mom has risk factors. So moms that deliver early, moms that are primiparous, moms that are obese or have other medical problems like preeclampsia. But ideally, this occurs within 72 hours. And it's triggered by this whole milieu of postpartum hormonal changes, but especially by the rapid decline of progesterone that follows the delivery of the placenta. So during pregnancy, progesterone has been inhibiting prolactin. Once progesterone goes away, that inhibition is removed, and prolactin then can go to work. Prolactin catalyzes the closure of tight junctions in the mammary epithelium, which I'll show a visual about in a second. And importantly, this tight junction closure or secretory activation in general is actually not reliant on breastfeeding and stimulation. So even mothers who don't intend to breastfeed can often feel their milk coming in or have secretory activation. However, even though it's not reliant on breastfeeding or stimulation, suckling or pumping results in prolactin release. And so if that's true, then theoretically, prolactin then in increased amounts should facilitate tight junction closure. It's also important to note that hand expression actually doesn't cause prolactin release. So this visual by that same secretory activation review paper, I think makes it a little easier to understand. So on the left here, in my left, hopefully your left, in pregnancy, you can see that there's multiple pathways, and this simplifies it a bit. There are many pathways in the breast. But in this visual, we're just showing transcellular pathways through which elements like sodium and citrate can move, as well as paracellular pathways, which are more active channels that can move sodium into the lumen of the breast and lactose out. So during pregnancy, these paracellular pathways are wide open. That means that any lactose produced in the lactocyte can immediately leak out through these tight junctions, and you can find lactose in the maternal serum. Now, after delivery, these paracellular pathways or tight junctions should start closing. But early on, in early milk, they are still open. So sodium is still able to be pumped in and lactose out. So you get a milk with a high sodium content, and you can still find lactose in the maternal blood. However, with established lactation, once you've completed secretory activation, those paracellular pathways should have squeaked shut. They should be completely closed, so that only leaves the transcellular pathways. Once this happens, you get this precipitous decline in sodium in the milk, as well as decreases in protein, and you get increases in lactose and citrate. So once these junctions close, the lactose basically gets stuck in the lumen. It can't exit the gland via those open paracellular pathways, and it then draws water into the lumen. Once this happens, voila, your milk should hopefully come in. And milk coming in is this kind of subjective sensation that's been relatively poorly studied in the literature. And this is because there's not really a universal definition for this feeling of milk coming in. It's described as the breast feeling larger or swollen or lumpy or warm or tingly, but there's not kind of one description in the literature. In addition, not all moms feel their milk coming in. And this is especially true if moms are overweight or obese, in which they might have more adipose tissue and less glandular tissue. And importantly, even though it's a very convenient measure because it's just something we can ask mom, like, when did your milk come in? It's really not well correlated with objective measures of secretory activation. And so even though it often serves as an informal proxy, it's really not a great indicator. So if instead we want to use more physiologic biomarkers, we could start with the urine. So serial measures of urine lactose have been described for over a century. As we saw in those visuals earlier, when those paracellular pathways are open during pregnancy, lactose can leak out into the bloodstream. It's then excreted in the maternal urine. And then conversely, when those pathways close, which then signifies secretory activation, lactose then stays in the gland, it doesn't leak out, and then urine levels drop. Now, urine lactose hasn't actually specifically been validated to measure secretory activation, but it has been correlated with increases in milk volume in term and preterm mothers. So it seems like it should be a relatively easy thing to use. You just pee in a cup. However, if you think about urine, it varies a lot throughout the day. So unlike the maternal serum levels of lactose, your urinary lactose measures, just like any other measure in the urine, really is affected by hydration status, how long it's been since the mother last urinated, etc. And so unfortunately, you can't just do a random urine lactose, which that would be convenient. Instead, the only validated way to check urine lactose is to obtain 24-hour urine collections and compare them. So if you think that you're going to ask an immediately postpartum mother to pee into a container every time she goes to the bathroom for the first couple of days postpartum and then save it for you, I can't imagine you're going to have a lot of moms who are going to be signing up for your study or are willing to do this clinically. So we can't use urine. So to better study tight junction closure, let's go to the actual milk itself. So as paracellular pathways close and lactose increases, as we talked about before, the milk composition pretty abruptly should change. Sodium plummets, protein decreases, and your lactose, potassium, and citrate increase. In addition, your sodium-potassium ratio decreases. And by measuring changes in these milk biomarkers, we can determine in near real time what's occurring in the mammary gland at a cellular level and really quite accurately measure closure without a specific relationship to milk volume. Now, this has been studied in the term population at least for a really long time. It was first reported in the 70s using milk biomarkers, and they were well studied a long time ago, back when I had permed bangs. It's relatively easy to do. You take serial or random milk samples, a small amount, less than 1 ml, and you collect these either when mothers pump or hand express if they're breastfeeding, although it's ideal to come from a complete collection of the breast so you get a uniform sample. If we're looking at protein, this requires skimmed milk and protein assays. We can look at lactose and citrate, also with skimmed milk, in enzymatic spectrophotometric assays. And in sodium and potassium, we have a few options. We can again use skimmed milk with flame photometry or optical emission spectrometry, or we can use whole milk with selective ion testing. And you'll notice for the first 3 biomarkers with skimmed milk, that would be something that then requires the lab because you have to spin the milk to skim it. With whole milk, though, something that could be done just with milk when you immediately collect it. So that's immediately something that sounds convenient. And fortunately, sodium and potassium ion testing, which you can do with whole milk, the group in Western Australia showed that it correlates well with the lab gold standard. So this is great because you can literally take a few drops of whole milk and put it into this little meter, which looks kind of like a pregnancy test. So what do we know about biomarkers, especially those in the preterm population? So the answer is not that much. So Cregan, again with the Western Australian group with Peter Hartman and Donna Getty's lab, looked at 22 mothers of moderate preterm infants. They looked at a single day, so just day 5, and they compared sodium, citrate, lactose, and protein to what were considered normal for term mothers. Now, they found that only 18% of preterm moms had all 4 of these markers within 3 standard deviations of the mean for term women. So they therefore said that the vast majority of their cohort had compromised lactation at day 5. And importantly, no term mothers had any biomarkers more than 3 standard deviations from the mean. So you can tell that this preterm cohort was very, very different than the term mothers. In addition, although it wasn't statistically significant, likely due to the small numbers in the cohort, you can see that the preterm mothers, who are in the black bar, versus the term mothers in the white bar, their sodium levels were very different. So you can see that they were had nearly 3 times the concentration of sodium on day 5 in the preterm cohort. And I'll look at some other studies to show why this is so important. But the high sodium signifies that their tight junctions are still open. In addition, preterm mothers with all 4 biomarkers in range at day 5 had much higher 24-hour milk production. So the milk production is this bar with the little speckles. And you can see that mothers who had all of their biomarkers in range, so similar to term mothers, made 400 mLs of milk a day. When you compare them, however, to mothers that had fewer biomarkers within the normal range, you can see that in a dose response manner, their volume significantly decreased, so that mothers who had 3 biomarkers out of norm only made 37 mLs of milk a day, so dramatically different. So based on this study by Cregan, my former group in Chicago and I looked at another cohort of very low birth weight infants. We looked at 16 mothers who importantly were pump dependent, as all the term studies really had been in mothers who were breastfeeding at breast. We looked at twice daily mother's own milk biomarkers. We looked at pumping records in detail, and we had all mothers weigh all of their milk from every pumping session, not just the ones that we tested, for 14 days postpartum. So we really wanted a nice longitudinal study of what happened in this kind of population. So in the first 14 days, the vast majority of mothers did not have samples with 4 biomarkers in range. The best day happened to be day 5, in which 40% had samples in range, but you can see that it kind of bounces all over. And most days, it was only about 20-something% of mothers who had samples with 4 normal biomarkers, suggesting again that the vast majority of these mothers had compromised lactation throughout actually the first 14 days of lactation. And to better really explain this visually, I wanted to kind of look at the lactation journeys of 2 different mothers in this study. So the mother in box A, just to orient you, is a mother who has kind of an ideal pattern or a healthy pattern that would be hopefully similar to a term mother. To orient you to the slide, on the left is the proportion of the biomarker, so how much it fell. On the right is the milk volume. On the bottom is the day, and on the top is how many times a day she pumped. You can see that the sodium, which is in red, dramatically falls in the first couple of days. So it looks like around day 3 or so. Her milk volumes at the same time, which are shown in yellow, dramatically increase. So you can see by about day 5 or so, she's making 500 mLs of milk a day. And she's a good pumper. She's pumping a lot, around 10 times a day or so. Now let's contrast this to the other mom. You can see when you look at the top that she's not pumping nearly as frequently, but I would say that she's a pretty typical mom. We know that a lot of our moms, even though we advise them to pump 8 times a day, often pumping 5 times a day or so might be all that they can get in, even though we know that's not ideal. We can see that her sodium levels don't drop nearly as much as the other mom. And her milk volumes in yellow really bounce around. But notice that the milk volumes are actually a different scale here. So she's making a lot less milk, only a few hundred mLs a day. The important thing about this slide, though, is this. Around day 12 or so, for some reason, she didn't have a good day. She only pumped twice. We can see that immediately her milk sodium skyrockets up, and it actually goes back to similar levels that she had in her colostrum. At the same time, we see that her milk volumes are going down. So this is showing that in this mom who already had kind of questionable closure of her tight junctions since her sodium levels didn't dramatically fall, once she decreased her pumping for a single day, her sodium levels really spiked, suggesting that her paracellular pathways immediately were able to reopen, risking her milk supply. And this hadn't really been reported in the literature. So in this cohort of 16 moms, of 8 mothers who later came to volume by day 14, so remember pumping at least 500 mLs a day, all of these mothers with good milk volumes later previously had samples with 4 normal biomarkers. They also normalized those biomarkers earlier. And moms who didn't come to volume, some of them never had any a sample with 4 normal biomarkers. In addition, like the Cregan study, there was a dose-response relationship between the number of normal biomarkers in the milk samples and the pumped mother's own milk volume. We then looked at a bigger cohort, also from Chicago, of 40 pump-dependent mothers of VLBW infants. And the vast majority of this cohort had a lot of risk factors. So most were overweight or obese. We had a lot of preeclampsia, a lot of choreo, and the mean infant gestational age was just under 29 weeks. And this was just published a few months ago. So our first question was, okay, so we know we can measure a couple different kinds of biomarkers. Which one should we be measuring if we want to look at cost and feasibility? Which one is best if we just want to do 1 or 2? So in this visual, you can see that the mothers who came to volume eventually, so they're in this kind of turquoise green color, versus mothers who didn't come to volume in those first 14 days in the red, they really dichotomize nicely with sodium. So those turquoise mothers with good volumes later really quickly decreased on their sodium and stayed down. When we looked at this in multivariable models, indeed sodium was selected the most and potassium the second most, and the other biomarkers significantly less. We decided to also look at sodium and potassium ratio in our cohort because it has been reported in multiple other studies. In term mothers, there is a strong inverse correlation between the sodium-potassium ratio in milk and the expression of tight junction proteins at the same time. And Peter Hartman's group has also looked at this sodium-potassium ratio, and they defined cutoffs as a ratio over 1 was considered pre-secretory activation, and a ratio less than 0.6 was mature milk, and transitional milk was somewhere in between. The Murace and Nonsom Rivers looked at sodium and potassium ratio in term mothers. They took a single milk sample on day 7 in nearly 200 moms, and they defined elevated sodium potassium ratio as something over 0.8 because this was the 75th percentile in their cohort. They reported that a high sodium-potassium ratio was twice as common if there was a subjective supply concern reported by the mom. And indeed, when they later asked moms if they were still breastfeeding at day 60, there was a really strong relationship between earlier high ratios and then no longer breastfeeding at 2 months of age. Looking at breast milk sodium, another Canadian researcher looked at 250 primiparous term mothers. 150 of them provided milk samples on a single day, this time earlier on day 3. Now, the caveat to this study is that those 100 moms or so who didn't provide milk samples, most of them didn't because they didn't have enough milk to do so after they fed their infant. So this is already somewhat a self-selected population of moms who had a bit more milk. She reported a mean sodium on day 3 of about 42, and we'll compare that to other studies in a moment. And she reported that there was a higher sodium in mothers who had gestational diabetes and even higher in those diabetics who were insulin dependent, suggesting that they were less likely to be closing their tight junctions. They also reported, for the first time in the literature, a lower sodium with increased breastfeeding frequency in a dose response manner. So you can see that moms that pumped between 0 and 4 times a day had a sodium of around 55, whereas those who pumped 11 times or more a day had a much lower sodium of 35 or so. In the same paper, they also reported that breast milk sodium on day 3 was related to self-reported breastfeeding practices, which were either exclusive or partial or no human milk at weeks 2 or 6. So showing again that even on day 3, we already have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen weeks down the road. The most common reason in this cohort, like in most others, for stopping breastfeeding was insufficient breast milk supply. So Jane Morton, quite a few years ago actually, also studied mother's milk sodium and future lactation success. She looked at 130 breastfeeding term moms and got a sample in the first weekish of life. And her cutoff for normal was 16. She found that if mothers had a normal sodium, so less than 16 in this first week of life, which was about half of the mothers, almost all of them were exclusively breastfeeding at 1 month of age with good infant weight gain. So presumably had a good milk supply. And of note, even in mothers that, in these mothers, their weight gain was higher in their babies than in mothers who had a high sodium, again, suggesting potentially a supply difference. They then looked at mothers who had high sodium, again, in this first week or so. So only 55% of these moms, so about half, were exclusively breastfeeding in a month with good weight gain. She also reported that both a higher sodium and a longer duration of high sodium in this first week negatively correlated with lactation success. And I want to point out in this visual on the right with the bars, you can see that the black bars are mothers who eventually were successful, who exclusively were breastfeeding. And the gray bars are moms that were not exclusively breastfeeding with good infant weight gain later. And you can see that in the black bars, even though moms initially had high sodium, they eventually fell. And the green bar, which is sodium of 16, they eventually did have normal sodium. So potentially had delayed lactogenesis or delayed secretory activation, but they got there. Conversely, the moms in gray, who remember were not exclusively breastfeeding a month later, they never got there. It wasn't that their secretory activation was delayed, but in these first 12 days, it was incomplete. So going back to our VLBW study, in our study, only a third of moms came to volume by day 14, so made 500 mLs of milk. We wanted to look at if there were convenient cutoffs that we could use. So we first looked at day 3, like other studies, and only about half of our moms had enough milk to sample because the baby obviously always got priority. So when we look at these 20 moms, Moms who later achieved coming to volume were much more likely to have normal sodium. And in this instance, we used normal sodium as the Cregan definition of plus or minus 3 standard deviations. And even though it wasn't statistically significant, the mothers who later came to volume had a much lower sodium. And they were below that 16 in previous studies. In addition, they were much more likely to have a low sodium potassium ratio. So if we look at this, the positive predictive value of coming to volume later, if you had a low sodium potassium ratio, was 82%. But what's probably even more important is the converse. So the risk of not coming to volume, if your ratio was over 1, was pretty high at 67. But if you also included moms who didn't have enough milk to test, because presumably if you have so little milk that you can't share a few mLs, you probably have a high ratio. If we lump those moms, then our negative predictive value is 85%. So now at day 3, we have a really pretty good test to show us that these moms at day 14 aren't going to have a lot of milk, which predicts that they're not going to have milk at NICU discharge, which predicts that they're not going to be breastfeeding as well months down the road. We also looked at day 5. And at this point, most mothers did have samples, and that includes the 25 mothers who never came to volume. And just as a side note, these vast majority of mothers who never came to volume, they were providing exclusive milk for the infants on day 5 because they had enough milk to give us as researchers. And I always kind of like to explain this to my medical students or my fellows that you need to be really careful when we say that mom supply is good or adequate. Because if I'm rounding and I ask the nurse or my clinical team, how's mom supply? The answer is usually, oh, it's pretty good. Like a baby's getting all mother's milk. But that answer is very variable depending on infant intake. So in this case, for a VLBW infant, the baby might have been getting 30 mLs a day. So it's really important when we're asking those questions to really put everything into context. Because these mothers later were not successful and weren't making good volumes, even though that might have been something that we would report on rounds, for example. So going back to our study. So mothers who achieved coming to volume versus those that didn't, on day 5, all of them had a normal sodium, and the vast majority had an ideal sodium of less than 16. What really was striking, though, was the sodium potassium ratio. So you can really see that these mothers really dichotomized with this sodium potassium ratio of less than 0.8. We also wanted to know, were these cutoffs, which we used based on the literature of 1 on day 3 and 0.8 on day 5, were they the best cutoffs for us to use in our preterm population? And when we looked at receiver operating curves and coming to volume, they were actually very similar to previously reported cutoffs. So as most talks always say, we need to know more. We need more validation in different preterm populations. We need to better understand how maternal risk factors come into play with milk biomarkers. In our preterm cohort, we found that pre-pregnancy BMI was also a risk factor for not coming to volume. And in that other term Canadian study, diabetes, but especially insulin-dependent diabetes, was a risk factor for high sodium, suggesting that these mothers weren't closing their tight junctions. Studies have looked at parity, and this study even actually looked at how maternal mental health might affect milk sodium and tight junction closure. So they reported in term mothers, when they took a milk sample in the first 2 weeks, that 1/3 had high sodium or high sodium potassium ratios. And those that had high levels were more likely to be prime-ups. But interestingly, those with high sodium or high sodium potassium ratios were also more likely to score high on a state and trait anxiety inventory, a sign of postpartum depression or anxiety. And they postulated that potentially mothers who were depressed or anxious were putting the baby to breast less, or there was less skin to skin time. which can presumably then affect lactation and tight junction closure. So we really have a lot more to learn. We also really need to know, and I think this is a critical question, is how do pumping practices affect biomarkers? So in the Canadian study, again, the Gallup study, she reported a lower sodium in term mothers on day 3 when they pumped more. And in our study, we reported that preterm mothers who came to volume were more likely to have 4 normal biomarkers and more cumulative pumpings in the first few days postpartum. And presumably, as we mentioned before, this is probably an effect of prolactin. And in the animal literature, specifically the goat dairy literature, which there's actually a lot of, milk stasis from an acute decrease in milk removal increases milk sodium, again, suggesting paracellular pathway leakiness in a similar way to those preterm mom that I had showed you her lactation journey for. So what do we do with this data? So in both normal term as well as preterm pump-dependent high-risk populations, mother's own milk biomarkers in the first 1 to 2 weeks postpartum appear to predict later lactation success. So which biomarkers should we use? Should we use sodium alone? Should we use sodium and potassium ratio? Sodium potassium ratio is often used because potassium is unaffected by that paracellular pathway closure. And so it kind of standardizes a more fluctuating sodium. So we need to study this in additional cohorts, some of which are being done by some colleagues in Chicago. How do we study these? So luckily, it seems that a point of care style test with this ion testing is accurate. It requires whole milk and potentially could be done at the bedside, maybe could even be done by mothers. And again, some colleagues are looking into this. So who should we use this for? Because clearly this isn't something that we should be biomarkering the whole population. So we need to look at cost and feasibility to see who would benefit from this. So in lower risk populations, presumably test weights and routine milk volume monitoring are enough. So what should we selectively test biomarkers if there are supply concerns? But in those higher risk populations, especially preterms, it could be helpful to test on day 3 and day 5. So mothers of very low birth weight infants, moderately preterm moms who have other risk factors, and they often have multiple risk factors. And can we use then point of care biomarker testing to individualize early lactation care and then hopefully optimize lactation success in high risk populations? Should we just use biomarker testing? Should we combine it or modify it with different maternal risk factors, like obesity, for example? And then how do we use this to target and modify lactation support? The challenge we have now as clinicians and as lactation researchers is our answer to not enough milk is, I don't know, pump more or make sure you have a good pump. And those are important, but they're very kind of generic and non-specific. So can we use biomarker data to potentially, for example, individualize pumping schedules, which might cause better compliance? For example, if a mom is pumping 5 times a day, she's not getting good volumes. And you see very often that moms get really frustrated. They say, like, something's not working, I'm just not meant to breastfeed. This is too hard. And if we say to pump more, they say, well, I mean, it's not really doing much, so what's the point of that? So what if we had data to show them that, okay, let's pump 2 more times today and check your milk sodium. And if they're pumping more, if we see changes in real time in their milk sodium in those first couple of days, we can tell them with decent certainty, if you keep pumping more, we really can see, like, into the breast, we can see what's happening. And we know that if you pump, say, 2 more times a day, it really seems like your breasts are going to change and to start making more milk. Or conversely, we've all had those moms who are like super pumpers and they start out of the gate really fast. They're pumping like 10, 12 times a day. and they just get burnt out. And then after a couple weeks, they're just done and they stop pumping early. Can we also help moms like that, or moms who are pumping a lot but not getting much? And to say, well, you're pumping 12 times a day, that's awesome, but your mental health is important too. And if we pull back 1 or 2 pumps a day, can we see before your volumes change, is this something that's going to be okay for your supply? Again, to improve compliance, because we all know that pumping is really challenging in the long term. Can we use this for other clinical indications, like when to initiate donor milk? We definitely have families that, for cultural or for other reasons, are a bit uncomfortable with donor milk, or potentially the baby doesn't qualify for donor milk, and so we're looking at formula. Well, what if when the baby's getting trophic feeds, if we're testing mom's milk, we could then have an idea of when her milk will come in before she knows it. And we can tell the clinical team, it looks like mom's gonna have a lot more milk by tomorrow. Let's hold off for half a day on increasing feeds with non-mother's milk because we think that she's going to get there. Or conversely, we still have a while to go. Let's work on pumping with mom, but we really need to address an alternative. And what can we do more than just pumping more? Can we actually facilitate tight junction closure if they're not closing with increased pumping? So whether that's at 5 days, these mothers' tight junctions seem to be delayed in closure, or whether they have incomplete closure at a week or 2. And the problem now is that we have to wait until mothers kind of have challenges or have low volumes. And then we look into things like galactagogues or maybe herbals, and we try to recommend things, but it's often, in my opinion, it's too late. You're weeks down the road. We really needed to address this really early on. So can we modify prolactin levels to affect tight junction closure? Should we give medications early? I know domperidone isn't available in the States, but we use it quite a bit in Canada and elsewhere in the world. But we often wait until, again, moms have low volumes. So if we have evidence that their tight junctions aren't closing, should we give this in the first week? Or more importantly, can we specifically give either prolactin or otherwise modify prolactin, especially in those first few weeks when it's most important? There was a nice study out of Boston quite a few years ago that actually looked at this question, and they used recombinant human prolactin for lactation insufficiency. There was actually 2 different groups of mothers and kind of lumped into the same study. There were a few moms who had documented prolactin deficiency, and there were a few moms who were moms of preterm infants who were pump dependent, who had low milk volumes. They gave recombinant human prolactin to both groups, and in both groups, they saw really nice increases in milk volume. Now, they weren't specifically targeting mothers of low birth weight infants who had incomplete tight junction closure, for example. It was just kind of a non-specific low milk volumes. But what if we actually targeted moms in a data-driven way who we know don't have complete tight junction closure? And when they actually looked at the milk of the moms in this study, which is this other paper here in pediatrics, they did find that indeed, when they gave more prolactin, the milk sodium decreased. So suggesting that this exogenous prolactin was indeed affecting tight junction closure. Now, the problem or challenge in this study, and the reason I wrote it needs to be convenient, is that at least in this study and in a couple other studies of recombinant human prolactin, it's given sub-Q. So it's given subcutaneously twice a day for the first month, which is a really big ask for these moms who are already pumping, who are already trying to recover postpartum and are trying to deal with often a sick baby. So it would be great if we could find a more convenient way, whether it's nasally or otherwise, to try to influence prolactin levels and to influence them early on. Again, in a targeted data-driven way where we can watch in real time to see if it's affecting tight junction closure. So I hope I've been able to kind of tell you the story that with long-term lactation, we really need to look a lot farther back. And the problem isn't at a few months, but it's really in those first couple of days of life. Those first days are really the key in which we have to hopefully try to modify things early. But we can only do that if we can predict who is going to have challenges. So in conclusion, I think that human milk biomarkers have the potential to lead us down a paracellular pathway to success, both in measuring and modifying high-risk lactation. I have lots of references if you're bored in COVID quarantine. And I'm happy to take any questions from the chat or from Medela. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that great information. It was very interesting. We do have about 10 minutes for questions and answers, so please go ahead and submit those through the chat function and we'll try to get to them. The first question that came in is, can you please explain in detail why hand expression does not work to stimulate the prolactin hormone? This is very important because are so many people, excuse me. This is very important because there are so many people that are very anti-early pumping.
Yes. So that's a great question. I've actually given multiple talks that are literally focused on this question. I am, I wouldn't say against hand expression, but I guess I am against hand expression alone. And that is because when you look at multiple studies, both in humans and in animals, you need suction to produce prolactin. So suction comes from a baby's mouth, or suction comes from a high quality electric pump. When you hand express, you release oxytocin and you release the milk that is already in the breast, but and that's because of compression, but there's no suction with hand expression. And so physiologically, you do not get a prolactin response. And this has been well documented, again, in humans and animals. And so a baby with their suction and some compression release both oxytocin and prolactin. A pump only releases prolactin and hand expression only releases oxytocin. But the money is really in prolactin to really set up that early feedback loop to close your tight junctions. Prolactin also increases at the cellular level the number of lactocytes, and it prevents apoptosis of lactocytes. So it helps you make more milk in a myriad of ways that hand expression just doesn't do.
Thank you for answering that. I was wondering that same question, and someone actually asked it. Actually, two people asked that question, so I'm glad we were able to answer that.
And you can definitely do hand expression like with pumping. I know like colostrum is thick and can be hard to get out, but I would never recommend it alone in the first couple of days. But I think hands-on pumping or expression with pumping is perfectly reasonable. So just to put that out.
Great, thank you. The next question that came in is, did the study state how pre-pregnancy BMI affects CTV?
Yes, so we found that that pre-pregnancy BMI, the higher BMI moms were much less likely to come to volume. Yes, and whether that's due to differences in prolactin levels or other other hormonal milieu problems, the fact that mothers who are obese or overweight are also more likely to have other medical complications, to deliver early, to deliver via C-section. It's often a myriad of risk factors that are all bundled together as well. But yes, they are less likely to come to volume.
Okay, the next question is there any downside to starting herbal galactagogues in moms at risk?
Downside as far as like early on or in general, I guess. So herbal galactagogues aren't that well studied in the literature. There was a nice review article that's in my references here that does go over specifically things like fenugreek, for example. And I think there are very few downsides to them. That being said, again, we don't have a lot of literature on it, but they've been used for millennia throughout the world. So I think it's something that's it's often reasonable for mothers to try early on that don't have a lot of downsides before you're looking at something with potentially serious side effects like domperidone.
Okay. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this question being in Canada, but you were in the US, so maybe you will.
I'm an American born and bred. I've only been here
Yes.
for 4 years.
Okay. So this question is here in the USA, how can a mother get Domperion?
So I don't think that they technically can. I'm not. Yeah, I think it's at least when I was practicing in the States, it wasn't really an option. Um, it's used a lot throughout the world. It's used a lot in Australia and in Canada, but there's, I think, technically not a legal way to obtain it in the States, unless you want to come north and visit us once the border reopens on hopefully June 21st. Not that I'm counting.
Okay. There is a uh, statement in the chat. People who I know have needed to order it from Israel online.
Like you
So,
technically can order it from Canadian pharmacies, but I'm not going to necessarily say that you should be doing cross-border pharmacological ordering. Technically you can. I'm not exactly sure of the legalities, so I'm not going to recommend that, but it is possible. I'm just going to
right.
say it that way.
And I thought I read something or heard something that they would confiscate it at the borders if it was found in shipping. So, um, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. But thank you for addressing that. The next question is, why do we not see prolactin being used more often?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a question I definitely have. It's there the few studies that were done of recombinant human prolactin. I mean, it's a human product, so it's limited and it's costly, and it needs to be given sub-Q. But I think that's definitely a huge opportunity for pharma to look into, like, why don't we have an artificial prolactin, or an easier way to give it? So I think that's hopefully something that can be looked into in the future. We know other substances like growth hormone, or a thyroid stimulating hormone, the TRSH, can also affect prolactin. Those are also, though, very expensive medications that are given via injection. So I think we definitely need to look into how we can either directly or indirectly modify prolactin in a way that's usable and convenient and feasible for mothers.
Okay, looks like we have time for maybe one more question. This question is, I'm an IBCLC and work in a NICU. We have more problems with getting to volume with later preterm than very early preterms. Do you know a reason why?
So this is actually well reported in the literature. Um, actually have a grant to study with this with some colleagues, and that these are kind of we call them the forgotten preemies, and that the extremely or very low birth weight infants get a lot of early lactation support. They often have been in hospital prior to delivery for a while and potentially have prenatal consultation and are more kind of prepared for the thought of pump dependency and already are ready to even do it in the delivery room. Whereas your moderate preterm infants, often these are mothers who come in and relatively quickly deliver because there's not the same incentive to continue the pregnancy as if they were 23 weeks and at the limits of viability, for example. They don't get as often intensive lactation support, and potentially they had the idea that they were going to be breastfeeding at breast, and so take a little bit longer to start pumping effectively. Um, this is also a population in which babies, if they're moderately preterm, babies have the physiologic ability to go to breast, and so often they are, but they're not effective. They might suck a little bit, but they're not effectively suckling, so they're not effectively causing that prolactin stimulation. So moms really have to be really good at pumping after every breastfeeding session in these moderately preterm babies. And I find that they don't always do that, or they aren't given this information about how critical that pumping is. Because the baby seems like they're doing something at breast, but they're really not effectively transferring milk. So I think it's a combination of factors of preparation, of support, and then of the baby being able to partially breastfeed.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Looks like we're at the top of the hour. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a couple quick things before we end. Certificates for the U.S. attendees will be available this Friday by downloading those, or downloading, sorry, excuse me, downloading those from your account. And our registration is available for our June 3rd webinar. This is the fifth and final webinar in the Breastfeeding Initiation in Crisis, the After Effects of COVID-19 series. And also the June 16th webinar is also available to register for. For more information and to register for those two, you can visit medilaeducation.com. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.